Everybody, good morning. Thank you, Meg. Thanks for everybody taking the time to join Marie Loeb and myself this morning to talk about neurodivergence. That's going to be a tough one for me today. And a very, very important topic, and one that actually touches pretty much every one of us because we're all neurodivergent to a certain degree. Marie, thank you for taking the time to help us with this really important topic today.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here. Talk about something that is very close to me and that I really appreciate. I have a lot of lived experience and also professional experience. And I'm excited to know sort of what people want to talk about and understand and just go into some nuances.
And we're going to get into some, and I appreciate your expertise on this and your experience. I think that it's really important to really define neurodivergence. We were just talking about that a minute ago. What is neurodivergence? What was being on the spectrum before? What is neurodivergent and neurodiverse these days? Let's start with a good definition.
Sure. Well, I will say that like everything, we're always getting new information and redefining things. But right now, I think a good way to think about neurodiversity is the way that we think about any kind of diversity, which is just that everybody has different types of being in the world. And if you think about just sort of, our bell curve of what's typical, we have some neurotypicals that are sort of in the middle. Generally, it's like an IQ of 90 to 110. They sort of like score average around sort of like a lot of contexts. And then there's people that are sort of on the outs of that bell curve. And those are the people that we sort of consider neurodivergent. So neurodivergent means anybody whose brain is just different. There's a lot of people within that umbrella, ADHD, autism, some different types of just like brain functioning. And a lot of times when we're talking about neurodivergent, it's still sort of this amorphous space where we're trying to figure out how we would sort of put people into diagnostic categories because it's still evolving. And, prior to the DSM-5 in 2013, autism and PDD-NOS and Asperger's were all different things, and you couldn't have them and also be ADHD. And now everything's sort of like changed. So it's like autism is a spectrum, and you can also have ADHD. And there's just a lot of discussion around all of the crossover that people see with giftedness, ADHD, autism, and all of these other elements. And so that's why a lot of times we just sort of talk about it with this monolith. Sorry, I'm having trouble speaking today. To really just talk about this group of people that are kind of misunderstood and feel a little different and out of step with the neurotypical world.
And how would a parent taking that information look at their child and say, what do I need to do to help my child now that I see there might be representing their brain capacity in a little different way, or they need something different? What are the signs parents should look out for that they may need to help guide a little bit more or get some help?
So there's a saying that's in the autistic community that it's not that it's hard to work hammering a square peg into a round hole, it's that you ruin the peg. So a lot of times what the first things that we see are either behavioral, like an externalizing sort of like expression of distress, or there's a lot of negative self-talk and internalizing. And so people oftentimes hear their kids say some pretty dark stuff that maybe they don't fit in, or they want to die, or nobody likes them. Sometimes this can be, from a variety of things, but a lot of times it's because this person just is not fitting in the way that the typical people do, and they're just feeling that friction. So just the person's own sort of like expression of their own distress, I think is the first one to just like really like take a step back and listen and see how they're perceiving the world and how they're understanding themselves in the world, to understand if there's something that's a little different. And the other thing is some asynchronous development, especially when we're talking about like high IQs. But neurodivergent people tend to sort of like be really great at some things and not great at other things. I generally say like average people are average across the board. But neurodivergent people sort of have more peaks and valleys. And so if somebody's like, you know, really recognizing that their kid is first of all just different, I would just start there. But if there is this like incongruence, then that's letting me know that they're really struggling in a way that we're missing, and to just get more information. I like to just think of it as data collection.
And I think what, what you just mentioned is really important, because I've seen a lot of this with kids that they know they have a excuse me, they know they have a special talent at an early age. And that makes everything else complicated in their life, because one thing comes super easy. And so I've noticed that with kids, and teachers don't necessarily know what to do with them because they represent as super bright in one area. So they're flustered why the child isn't performing in the other
Yeah.
areas.
Yeah, and I think that, and I'll just speak for myself in this one. I taught myself to read when I was 3, and was sort of sat in the back of the classroom, because even when you're in sort of gifted progressions, if you're just different, they don't really have a space for you. They're teaching to the mean. Um, and that just makes a really difficult space when they're also wanting you to do things that are sort of life skills. So I just didn't do homework for, you know, a decade and a half. And that's important to learn how to do. It's important to learn how to sort of mark those out. And so I know that when I'm working with a kid or even a young adult, and we're going over things, a lot of times they've compensated with systems that maybe are breaking down as things become more complicated, because they just sort of like left on their own, and they weren't given that individualized attention when they were small. A lot of times they manifest that in their bodies. So have a lot of kids who have sort of some chronic pain elements, and chronic headaches, some other things of just like what it is to hold all of that in.
It's interesting because I now look back and I can see how easy it is for our kids to somaticize and to create a stop. What's the easiest way to get out of going to school? I don't feel well.
Yeah, and oftentimes that stomach pain is real. That
There-
it's just feels so uncomfortable to be in those spaces in a way that you can't really articulate, because you don't understand how different you are from other people. Everybody thinks that everybody's brain is kind of like their brain, and so they don't really stop to think about just really different structures.
And I'm sure that the incidence of comorbidity with anxiety has got to be close to 100%.
Yeah, I would say anxiety, symptoms of depression, and then also symptoms of trauma.
Is that a chicken and the egg, where the trauma from being seen in school is different, then creates the anxiety, and the anxiety creates more of.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the elements that like we're still trying to learn more about. Um, like I was saying with the square peg round hole ruin the peg analogy. Um, like just being different and feeling like you're not like others, and you're having to mask and force yourself to look like other people based upon your understanding of other people's behavior. That's anxiety producing. And like that feeling of loneliness, like that's depressing. Um, in addition, when you have an information seeking brain that always wants information, like going back to me, like what kind of a 2 and 3-year-old sits down with books and audio cassettes and just tries to like learn to read? Like my brain was searching for stimuli that it wasn't getting. In the absence of like good stimuli that brains want, sometimes they're going to look and they're going to like overthink about social constructs or social interactions, and then like just that manifestation is going to look just like social anxiety, but it's your busy brain.
So what should a parent do in that? I mean, if they see their child pulling away or doing something, what can we do as parents to help guide our kids to see where that really is coming from? Is it coming from, are they placing it on the social because they know they're different? You know, or what can we do as a parent when we see a warning sign? And what would those warning signs be other than just pulling away?
Yeah, well, I think anything that would be related to other sorts of disturbing mental health statements, especially related to feelings of not belonging or suicide. A lot of times kids just sort of say something really big because they have big feelings and they don't know how to articulate it. And it can be really scary. So a lot of times when I am interacting with a family, it's after they've been through the emergency department, or I used to work in the emergency department, and it's kids sort of trying to express themselves. So I would say the first thing is to just not not panic that this kid is telling you something or expressing, or even in their silence and pulling away. If you're able to have a conversation with them, like that's a gift. They're trying to connect with you. And I really think about like if I want somebody to join my world, I first need to understand their world. And then I can build a bridge. So a lot of neurodivergent people have very rich inner worlds and have a lot of complex thoughts. And if I can understand the way that they see the world when they perceive it, then I can build a connection so that they can better understand the world. And I can find out, like, what are the goals? Do they have a goal of having friends at school? Do they see those kids and they feel excluded, and they want to know how to interact in those spaces? A lot of times when we're looking at kids, we make a lot of assumptions about what makes a typical child. And then we have those markers, but we're not asking that individual kid about what feels good for them. So I think just taking a deep breath, slowing down, and letting them know that their experience is valid and that there's a space for them. They'll find their community.
And how do parents help their teens who've been teased or excluded because they're neurodivergent? Do they, is there something else that we can do as far as the bullying side of that?
Sure. Well, I think that there's so many elements to that, which is that I'm in Washington, where they have some pretty specific laws related to bullying in school. And the goal, and this is not always followed, but the goal is that you change the culture of the school. You don't like get the bully and the victim in the same room and have them talk it out. I know that that's how it was when I was growing up. But really thinking of a culture change, a systemic change, and really thinking about, like, okay, this kid's weird. Like, we're assigning a value and a morality to, like, them being different or weird that we don't assign to people that we think are special, like Einstein or Tesla, even though they were very weird. And so helping people understand of, like, like, what is your difference? What do you need? And again, like, what kind of community or environment can we build around you? And a lot of that is like the trauma of healing, where you have been harmed by people reflecting to you your difference. You have tried to mitigate that difference by masking. You have probably lost parts of yourself in trying to not be too weird or nerdy or loud. And then, so part of the work, and like, once we recognize what's happening in either adolescence, early adulthood, or even beyond, once we're understanding why we're different and how we're different, we have to do a whole new identity formation. And so, what would it be if somebody's getting teased for liking Star Trek, and then we introduce them to an entire community of Trekkies? Taking things out of the social construct and then giving a new perspective can be incredibly healing.
It's funny you bring that up, because that was my next question, which is, since we know that neurodivergent brains just develop differently and unevenly, knowing that the brain can have an area that has developed more in one area. So like they have this interest in Trekkie, or they're musically inclined, or math geniuses. What's the theory on giving them more of the very thing? So let's use math or some type of educational piece to this. So they love math, they love computer science. What is the implication on the growth of the brain when we put more emphasis on the one area they're already really talented in?
I think that that's a really interesting sort of discussion, because a lot of current interventions are trying to really bring up the things that people are delayed in, and reducing the amount of things that people engage in their special interest in. And I think just coming from a space of just like being really neurodiversity affirming, I say that I love it when people can pursue their special interests. And I really think of Nikola Tesla as a good example of just how I approach this. So genius, created, you know, we wouldn't have Wi-Fi without him, and died penniless, right? In squalor, really deep in mental illness, because he trusted people. He had an invention and they said, we just don't have the money right now. Can we just build it and we got you later? And he trusted them, and they didn't have him later. So like with that sort of scenario, I would want to encourage this amazing understanding of electricity and creativity. And I want to figure out what's a can't, or what is like a lagging skill. So with that, like I would want to get him a business manager, because I know, because of his neurodivergence, he is unlikely to understand when people are taking advantage of him. And I want to build a support in there. Of course, there's like business skills and acumen and things to look for that I would want to instill in that. But really, I want to highlight somebody's special skill. I want them to connect with other people that have the same passion. I want to be able to create environments where people can be innovative. And I want them to not be taken advantage of and be able to function in our society.
So really balanced approach. So it's not saying, well, you're already really talented over here, I'm just going to focus over here and continue this extra neurodiverse, added brain power in the one category and ignore all the other areas. It's really saying, I see that you're exceptional in this one area, but we also need to expose you to some other things so that we just don't create your brain going in one direction.
Yeah. I think that a lot of it is related to adaptivity in our society. So like we were talking about with anxiety and depression as like being marks of that. I'm going to give an example of one of my kids, which is that it's really common for autistic kids to also have some fine motor delays and handwriting especially. So he was taught from the age of 3 to just practice print writing as fast as he could. And then at some point they said, yeah, this just isn't getting any faster. Let's just introduce cursive and just see if he picks it up faster, because it would be a new skill in his brain. And then once he got to middle school, they said, hey, we just keep telling him, stop writing in cursive, it's going too slow, just print. And then they were going to try to do more OT. So this is somebody who'd done OT like their entire, 3 through 13 of just handwriting. And it was incredibly frustrating to just be told constantly that like you're not good at this and that you need to go faster. And so then I had a conversation then I said, I don't really care how fast and legibly he can write. Could we just do some assistive tech and just teach him how to take notes like through typing? That seems much more of an adaptive skill for our society. A lot of times when we're thinking of like lagging skills, we're not necessarily thinking of what they're going to do with those lagging skills, what they need in their lives going forward. A lot of times we're just thinking about like, how do we make them look like a typical kid?
Well, and this is a really big topic right now, because in the universities, they're taking away the computers. So we have this generation who's now being brought up on typing skills, the writing because of a variety of reasons, neurodivergence, OT needs, just whatever it is, that a lot of these kids aren't learning to handwrite. And now they're getting to college and they're having really stressful experiences because the teachers are saying, we handwrite everything in this class.
Yeah.
No computers allowed.
Yeah. And I think that that's a good, that's a really good example of when we aren't really communicating with each other. So a lot of times when I'm going into an IEP meeting for a teen, I'm asking for accommodations that I know that they can get in the colleges that they're looking at. So that we're looking ahead at the long game of this. So a lot of times they'll say, oh, I'll just get pushed back because it's something that's atypical. And I was like, but it's not atypical. And the colleges that this person's looking at, all of them offer this, and all of them have this expectation. And can we start preparing them for self-advocacy related to accommodations for the environments that they're going to exist in?
And the thought of doing that so much earlier, and I know a lot of parents here that are on this and other webinars that we've done have been really concerned about getting IEPs or getting any accommodations. And what we're seeing now is that the colleges want to see that much earlier. They don't want you showing up at college and asking for accommodation that you haven't asked for before 11th grade.
Oh my gosh, yes. And going back to just sort of like helping somebody know their shape, like to me, that's the first thing. So if I know like my shape and I can advocate for that in my environment, then I know that I can ask for a quiet space, or I can find myself a quiet space to do work. I can create these environments on my own. I can take time for myself. I can meet my own needs. But if we're not teaching that from a really young age of how are you different, and what do you need to feel safe and able to do your best work in these environments, then what we're really teaching kids is just, how to conform and how to pretend to be okay. And so I've had a lot of kids who are just like, I've been working with them and then they're about to go to college. And that's when all of the systems that they had fall apart, because they've been doing such a good job at conforming that they hadn't built up those other skills of self-understanding, self-regulation, and really self-advocacy.
Which is a really important thing for our takeaway today for all of our parents involved, is how much it is okay for our kids to be different and to meet them where they are. And as you say, to always make sure that the environment is more for what the kids need rather than what we need or what we think is just the norm. And it's okay to ask those questions. Is this right? And how can I change it? Maybe you're changing it for more than just your child.
Absolutely. I often think of the difference between a need and a service. So if I just ask you to borrow your car tomorrow, we can have a whole conversation about, the logistics of that. Or I could tell you, oh, my baby sister's flying in and she has a lot of anxiety and I want to be the one that picks her up at the airport. If I told you my need, then we could problem solve to solve that problem. But if I'm just focused on the service, we're really going to miss my actual need for connection and support, and that is. So when we're going to environments that we know there's going to be expectations, like what's the actual need in that? If I'm taking my kid to out to dinner, what is the actual need that I have for my kid to be there? And then what are things that I can let go of? I think that the Ross Green collaborative problem solving approach does this really well, of really identifying like what is like so important to me that it's non-negotiable, what's something I can let go of, and then what's something that we can collaboratively problem solve together.
And the anxiety that the parents see, right, going into this, the nervousness that we bring in, our kids feel.
Oh my gosh. I mean, neurodivergent people tend to be hyper empathetic. And so some research that I've read on like on a synesthesia as it relates to the mirror neuron system for emotions is that there's a part of the brain that can pick up more readily all of the emotions, but the part of the brain that's distinguishing, is it mine or yours, is smaller. So that's been helpful for me in thinking of just my own experience of, I can see a kid come into a room or even a young adult and they just feel everything that's in that space. And if they're in an environment, especially a school environment, where people are pretending to have an emotion that they don't have, it's really hard to understand why you're dysregulated in that, but you feel dysregulated. So teachers that get frustrated and they have, like a smile on their face, but they're really frustrated with the child, like I tell them that is an invitation to get bit. That is just so dysregulating. And so that's the first thing when, like we're sitting with our own kids, even if we're feeling overwhelmed, is to take a deep breath. because we need to be grounded in our authentic feeling and be able to communicate to them like what's ours and what's theirs. Because otherwise we're just going to add to it and we're just going to like increase the anxiety in that space.
The biggest sign that we have that our child is having a real problem is when they start spinning. And what do we do as parents? We meet them right where the spin is, as opposed to saying, okay, I'm going to step back. I'm going to be a bumper on the lane. They're looking for me to be the calming factor. And we don't want to teach
Absolutely.
them to meet in the fight or in the spin. We want to teach them to come and find out that there's something that's really calm, just waiting on the sidelines.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I like to help kids chart out their escalation cycle so that they understand all of the elements of what it looks like. Like, what does it look like just really early when you are starting to get triggered by an environmental factor or something internal like a thought? And then what does that look like? And what would you like me to do? And then when we get to the top where we're just sort of like, it's in the red, like that's just focused on safety. That's the time where I'm going to stay away and I'm going to say, hey, I have created this little space with your favorite things. I am sitting and ready to listen when you are ready to talk. Because like what they need is help co-regulating. Again, like if they've just been working on acquiescing to their environment and conforming, they don't have that skill. They just know how to hide it. And so a lot of times it's going to look like, a switch is flipped because they're already so escalated just trying to conform that they have no room to go before they're in the red. And so helping them understand all of that, helping them know that it's okay to have distress and that show them ways to do it. That's perfect. But yeah, it's really overwhelming when we see our kid in that state. And it's really easy for us to get escalated as well.
Or jump in and try to fix when they really just want us to be, again, a calm bumper on the lane.
Absolutely.
It's not the fix it time. Although we're going to go into fix it mode in our own brains, we can hold that and wait to come back later to use it. But I know I've fallen prey to that many a time where I've had a child who has a moment or two, and I go into fix it mode live, and I realize that's not what they need or want at that time.
Yeah. And in fact, like after they have that peak of just escalation, they're going to crash in that post-crisis depression. And then you have to wait even further before you can even get into problem solving when they're like back at their baseline. And that just takes so long. Yeah, in the moment. That's why I like to have a plan ahead of time of just like hypotheses of like, hey, I'm guessing that like what you're gonna like is if I bring you a cup of hot chocolate and I just sit by you. Let's just see how it works. And then after the escalation, checking in. How did that feel? Do you want to change anything?
I love that. I love just being there with them and not going into action. What do you recommend for parents whose kids are highly anxious and depressed? They've already been to a psychotherapist. The psychotherapist did not see them or understand them. The child knew that, and now is refusing to go to the next psychotherapist.
Oh, I think that that's a really difficult element. I will say that I see kids um, and adults who have been to many, many therapists who have been looking at them through a very small lens of sort of like neurotypical expectations, and there is so much resistance. Um, I think that the first thing is that I like it when people can just normalize neurodiversity and normalize neurodivergent therapists and talk about why maybe some people can't really see us. I like to explain the double empathy problem. And there's some research where they had, autistic people playing telephone, and then they had neurotypical people playing telephone, and both of them expressed the same ideas consistently through. Like people can communicate within their neurotype, but when they combined the two in a mixed neurotype group, the messages got all jarbled. So not to say that like we have to like be exclusionary in ours, but it's just more difficult to communicate across neurotype. And so having a kid or an adult being able to have access to mental health professionals who are within their neurotype, or at least have the training to understand their neurotype, can be life-changing. And getting them in the door, I know, is super hard. So that's where I sort of go with the normalization. And hopefully the therapist that you would want to work with has some materials online, or can do a consult, or can share some ideas. So at least like the person can see the online presence and get an understanding of how this person approaches it. And I like that if parents can do their own work. And if you feel like your kid just will not go to therapy, then you going in and meeting with a therapist and trying to just create some systemic changes that will feel better for your child can be huge. So when I'm coming into a situation and the kid is having big behaviors, big unexpected problems, the first stage is I just look at the system, like the family system or the school system, and I say, like, is this system like able to meet everyone's needs? And if that's true, then I go in and then I say, okay, could I expect this system to meet the needs of a kid that had the same diagnosis and presentation? And if that's true, then I say, hey, kid, what is happening? Right? That's my third level. But a lot of times we just jump in right to fix the kid. So when parents say my kid refuses to do all of these other things, and I say, yeah, well, your kid may be the canary in the coal mine, and let's look at your system and let's see what things you can introduce. Most of the time, what happens is that the kid sees all of the changes that are happening in the family system and how they feel more seen and understood. And then they equate that with the therapy that their parents have been doing to create those changes. And then they're more open to engaging in those changes as well. It just feels terrible to feel like you're identified as the problem.
And yet you're absolutely right. What's the first thing we do? We look at our child as the problem and we get them right to as many extra, people we can in their already dysregulated schedule. I know as parents, there's no manual. We're doing the best we can. It's learn on the job training. And it's a very hard job because it's also a mirror
Yeah.
right in front of us that we might be saying, I don't want to see that, but I can see it in my child. So let me fix the child. And subconsciously, we're trying to fix ourselves through that mirroring. And I think what you just mentioned is so important. I was going to ask, actually, was my next question for you, which is how often with the kids you see that are really dysregulated, and again, I'm saying this with full love in my heart to all parents out there learning on the job, do you see that the partners that are parenting this child are opposite in their approach, are not getting along, one's upset with the other for making certain decisions? How often do you see that dysregulation is happening and coming up through our children?
Yeah, well, I'm going to be like a very broad and generalist in this answer. I will say that usually if you have a neurodivergent kid, then one or both of you are neurodivergent, and knowing that sort of like birds of a feather flock together, I would assume that maybe both of you have some of those traits. And oftentimes when we're looking at our kid, you're right, like maybe this kid is expressing a trait or a behavior that we have in ourselves that we've been ashamed of because we've been taught to mask or conform. And so we're trying to quash that early. And so we're having our own sort of internal battle with that. I will say that what I see most often is in heterosexual relationships, the dad who, for societal reasons, has had a little bit more privilege than the mom, tends to see their difference as like a superior that doesn't need to be changed, and has some resistance to thinking that there's anything that is wrong with the kid or that needs to be modified. And then just gets frustrated by the big behaviors. So not really recognizing like the individual quirks. but really seeing the behaviors as something that needs to be fixed. And then most of the moms that I work with overfunction, and they're trying to learn everything. They're taking all of the webinars that they can, and they're making binders, and they're trying to take all of these pieces of information, and then it's complete disconnect between the two parents. And so a lot of times people will bring in their kid to an intake, and I'll say, yeah, I'm not worried about your kid right now, but you two, like, I can tell you're not communicating, you're not on the same page. You haven't identified just sort of value sets and ways of approaching difficult interactions that are consistent, and something that all kids need, but especially neurodivergent kids really need consistency and knowing what to expect.
I've noticed in, in my own home and all my friends' homes with kids that have exceptional gifts in one area and then other things are harder, is that as soon as the parents meet on the same landing, suddenly everybody has better dinner conversation. If they're able to sit at the table together, things just get a little easier. And I think what I was going to circle back to, which what you just said, is one parent over parents, which is the overcompensating structure that happens when one parent says, I can't handle this and I can't see this, and steps away. It puts an unnecessary burden on an already probably overly involved parent who's seeing the problems and now saying, we've got to get to this doctor and we've got to get to this therapist and I've got to work with the school. And, honey, whichever gender it is, right? Because it can be either one. They're the same dynamic occurs. How do you get the other one to show up to the meetings, to not make it harder and not bring, so it creates a self-fulfilling, stressful environment, definitionally, just trying to process this.
Absolutely. And then how are you supposed to help this kid as they become an adult, like have independent living skills, when there's so much functioning that you have to do, especially as one parent, when another parent is not on the same page, that we're not really focused on, okay, is the kid going to the IEP meetings? Is this person understanding, their own trajectory? Can they take accountability in their own health? How does this work? How can they have agency in their own life? It just becomes all of these well-intentioned cogs that are just not fitting well into the machine.
And I love your analogy of the square peg in the round hole, and it just breaks the peg when you just try to force it in. When we look at these first signs of our children being anxious, depressed, and we see, it's some of these kids, it's very obvious they have a skill in one area, which is definitely going to make everything else more complex. Is that the best time to then get them tested, to get the neuropsych testing and get a map? And when they go and get that neuropsych testing, now that we're looking at neurodivergence and trying to find somebody that understands it, what would be the key words that a parent would look for when choosing a neuropsych tester?
That's an excellent question. I think just personally, I love data, and so I say test early and test often. I'll say that like when they have a neuropsych testing, they're looking at like one point in time, and we can't make huge generalizations about the kid's life or their potential based upon one snapshot. So I say just like not being afraid of just getting in and finding out information. One of the biggest things that I look for is just, especially within the IQ range. So a lot of smart kids get missed because they have an above average or high IQ. But when you break it down into all of the subcategories, maybe their working memory is incredibly low, and we're just like missing that piece. And if we could give them some support and scaffolding related to their working memory, then we can make this huge change. And there's just nothing that's rougher for a kid to just feel like I'm trying my best and people don't believe me and I just can't do it and maybe I'm a bad kid. Like that is detrimental. So testing early, just looking at it as a snapshot. It's a really important information, and we don't need to base somebody's entire life on for one snapshot. And so when I am looking for somebody to do assessments, I'm looking for somebody who understands neurodiversity as it relates to that these are not problems to be, these are not people that are problems to be fixed, that we're looking at just like trying to get a good picture of this person's individual strengths and challenges. And so I look for people when they on their website or their materials that they're sort of celebrating difference, and that they express that they want to give people individualized recommendations. So I will say in a ton of the neuropsych reports, everything ends with either this person needs CBT or this person needs ABA when I'm looking at like autistic diagnoses, without really specifying why or how that would be helpful for the person. So really like trying to connect with somebody where you understand that they are looking at a person and trying to understand the person in front of them, and not just focused on putting them into categories. The categories are incredibly important for access to services and for us to understand ourselves, but it's not the only capacity that I look for.
I think what you said about testing often is something that parents don't necessarily know. And, it can be costly. And I don't know if there's any services out there that are helpful for families that can't go into these top neuropsych assessments on a regular basis. I know that, neuropsych can change from year to year in our children. So if it's not something you just had once and then say, okay, we know my child, we know what high school they're going to go to, what college they're going to go to, we know how their brain operates. We knew it for that minute.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really like to build a team. And so part of the team is that I usually at least bring in an occupational therapist, maybe a speech and language pathologist. And then for the testing that I want to have done repeatedly are tests where we've made a pretty big decision about what this kid is capable of. I want to be able to test that. And for that, you can just go in and you can get just those specific tests done. You can get a new IQ test with all the subscales. When you go into OT, like they're going to do the initial assessment to sort of understand where the executive functioning is related to that. And then you can also do an SLP who does executive functioning support as well, but from their perspective. So you're getting all of these different points of data. And when you are in the IEP system, you can request additional testing, and then that's part of the process.
So you get it through that. And do the schools offer certain type of psych and educational testing, and how would that differ from what you would get in outside assessment?
So it's a little tricky because schools can only do assessments related to academic performance. So when maybe when they're looking at occupational therapy, a lot of school districts only give you occupational therapy support if you have bad handwriting. Even though occupational therapy handles all organization and executive functioning and all of these other elements of what you need to be successful in a school for. So every 3 years, they do sort of an assessment, just generally if you qualify for a service, to reassess that. But you can ask for individual things and they will tell you whether or not they meet criteria for services. But if you go to a private OT and you get all of that information and you bring it back, they're required to go through that, and they can adapt the IEP based upon an outside perspective or based upon your neuropsych perspective. And then once the OT is engaged in the school, then you can have conversations and they can collect more data and try to get a better understanding of the child's needs.
And can I go back for 1 second? What is SLT, just for those?
Oh, SLPs are speech and language pathologists. A lot of times people just think about diction, but really they handle all of the sort of like the communication that's within ourselves, and really can do a lot of work with executive functioning, and helping people understand like this is what is happening in an environment, and here's another way of approaching it. When my kids were small and I would do a bunch of things to keep them safe in the community because just the curiosity was overwhelming. One day I asked my child, um, like, how are we going to be safe in the zoo today? And he said, I'm going to ask questions and not do questions. And I was like, oh, that's perfect. That's what I want you to do. Because if he could ask me to set up, like he'd like to do science experiments, I would set it up for him. But if he just snuck out of the house and tried to build a flying machine and testing it off the roof, obviously I would get upset. So an SLP can really help with that, really help with like, what do I want to do in my environment? What do I want to get out of this? How can I access my desires and communicate in a way that makes sense in in these constructs?
And when we're looking at our children and getting the different testing and assessments, right? Some of these kids get to college and haven't had a lot of this because a lot of this is really new and in the forefront only now. So for kids that are 22 and graduating from college, what would you recommend for those tests? If somebody wants to have a testing to help them understand how they best work in the world, what would you recommend on that level?
Um, well, I think that it's a complicated answer, at least for me, and because you sort of hit it on the head earlier, which it's incredibly expensive, especially for adults. As soon as you hit sort of 18, a lot of places will stop assessing. And at least in my area, more and more people stop taking insurance. So then people have to pay cash out of pocket. So when there's somebody who's an adult, I try to assess like what do we need? Like what do you want to get out of this? What does it mean for you? In the neurodivergent community, it is very well respected to be self-diagnosed as neurodivergent. It is not in the medical community or in education. So if you're going to a school, they're not going to take like, oh yeah, I'm self-diagnosed autistic. I want these accommodations. So getting an assessment for that can be really impactful. Generally, I refer people to get on the wait lists for like occupational therapists that are neurodiversity affirming, to as like a first step to know what level that they want to do. Ideally, they would be able to do a full neuropsych, but I would really love for them to just have somebody who has a master's in this to sort of walk through, what are you doing in your life? What's more difficult than other elements? Where is this coming from? Why are we having this? Is this like a sensory integration difference? Is this an executive functioning difference? Because most of the time when I'm talking to somebody who's even a young adult, the information that they want is, why is this so hard? And how can I make things feel better?
It's really what it comes down to for all of us on any given day, right? Why is this hard? And what are we looking at? What did we miss in our training? And how do we help kids that are representing, they're demonstrating a frustration in an area and not try to fix them? That comes all the way back to that very concept.
Yeah, absolutely. But I will tell you that I have many adults in their 30s and 40s who are now getting their first neuropsych eval. And it has been so healing for them to say, like, oh, I thought I was lazy. I thought that that because of this. So my IQ is in the 99th percentile and these subscales, and working memory is a big one. My working memory is in the 2nd percentile. I thought that that was because I was just lazy. People kept saying, but you're too smart to make that mistake. And it's a really healing space for people. And unfortunately, we just don't have the systems to support a lot of adults doing that. So that's why it feels complicated. It's like, ideally, yeah, let's get all the data. Let's understand ourselves. And it's just not always accessible.
What you just brought up really hits home for me, which is when people label our children smart, the implication, especially on the younger ones. If you
Yeah.
could talk about what that means, because A lot of times when you have a kid who's neurodiverse and really demonstrating excelled skills at an early age, everybody wants to label them. You're the next Steve Jobs, you're this, and they put that pressure on them. And I know that there is an implication when we label a child smart, we mean only good intentions, but I'd love for you to talk about what happens in the body when a child hears they're smart but doesn't feel smart. They're struggling on the inside.
Yeah, well, it's incredibly dysregulating. And I also just want to start with like I mentioned, like Einstein and Tesla and Steve Jobs is another example of like these are people that have created like really amazing things and uh really struggled in a lot of areas of their life. So when we take one idea of like that you're gifted or that you're going to achieve all of these other things, and then we apply it on the kid without looking at the nuance that you know, Einstein really struggled in a lot of capacities in his life, especially like interpersonally. Um, we are saying that that being smart or being gifted is one static element that's in your life, and that you can't have nuance, and you can't struggle, and that we will often attribute morality to mistakes of you not trying hard enough. I know that when I was a child, I had teachers say, like, I just don't know why you don't apply yourself. You're the smartest one in my class. And that is, it's incredibly confusing because it does feel so hard to maintain in a neurotypical world. Maybe that kid is putting all of their energy into just conforming to look like everybody else. And now they're feeling completely unseen and and um and just really alone. A lot of times there's a lot of internalization and complete loneliness. That's when I really start to see the stomach aches and the headaches, and kids just like repeatedly getting sick because there's just so much stress on their bodies.
They're working through so much. I really want to talk about the gender diverse, neurodiverse child
Yeah.
because that we see the most depression, anxiety, and struggles. The internal struggles are so real. And I want to make sure we get enough information out there and talk about that because that's such a prevalent problem right now as far as kids trying to figure out who they are with almost too many options right now.
Yeah, well, I'll say that that there's more and more research coming out, sort of showing what people in the community have been saying, which is that there is a high corollary between neurodiversity and gender diversity. Also with just being queer. So you have these intersections of just difference. There's a lot of thought about like why and what's happening. I will say that just sort of my lived experience is that, you know, if you have the kind of brain that's asking questions all the time and is not taking things just based upon tradition and wants to know social constructs, then you're pretty likely to start thinking about what's the social construct of gender and how do I fit within this and what do I want. Um, and what's really difficult is that, you know, we just don't give a lot of space for people to ask questions, for people to explore things. So very quickly, you know, the idea of masking and conformity comes back. And that's where there is so many detrimental mental health effects with kids is in suicidality. There's so much research that shows that if parents are just like seeing their kid and meeting them where they're at related to gender or whatever form of identity they have, that the stress and all of the psychological sort of like ailments dissipate.
I think the bottom line is meeting our children where they are. And that's what you brought up in the beginning. It's the theme throughout. It's just trying to make sure that we're asking ourselves the question of, are we asking our children to conform? Or are we seeing them for how they're presenting, how they're feeling? What are their outward symptoms of an internal struggle? And how can we best meet them right there with the calmest, I don't need to fix you because you're not broken approach to parenting?
And I also want to acknowledge that we don't live in a world that can really adapt to our kids all the time. And so sometimes there's a safety issue. This happens a lot with communities of color, where they say, yeah, you know, I know that like my child has done big behaviors where the police have responded, and they've just helped us find him as an example, because he used to elope a lot. But other people with brown and black kids, they don't have the luxury of feeling safe when the police arrives. And so they're much more likely, just generally speaking, to ask their kid to conform because it's just a safer environment. And oftentimes that happens with gender. So if we're living in an environment where it's just not safe for you to explore your gender, then let's have a conversation about that. I don't want to be like the first bully, but I do want you to be safe in the world. And how can I express sort of like what I'm seeing and help you like create your own path and guide it in that way so that you feel completely seen and understood, at least by me.
Well, everybody wants to be seen and understood. And today, I think you provide us with so much information. That hour flew by. And I want to make sure I honor our timing with everybody. We are so grateful for everybody who shows up to hear this. And we at CHIP just love helping people understand how the brain, the body, how everything works together. So thank you so much. You can email admin@chip.org with any further questions. If you need any resources, we always love to be an additional resource. And I can't thank you enough for joining us, Maria, and helping us and walk through the neurodiverse child and how we can best meet them.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. See you next month.